Marcus had spent the last 2 years believing he was the luckiest man alive. He was a simple guy from a humble, hard-working family, while Marina came from a glittering world that consisted of money and high expectations. They had met under the most academic of circumstances. Marcus, the topper of his class and a brilliant scholar, had been hired as a private tutor to help Marina through her toughest courses. What started as late-night study sessions over thick textbooks eventually softened into something much deeper. He admired her grace, and she was captivated by his intelligence and the way he could explain the most complex ideas with ease. They were convinced that their love was a bridge strong enough to span the massive gap between their social classes. However, the bubble they lived in during their university days began to leak the moment they stepped into the harsh light of the professional world. While Marina's family expected her to maintain a lifestyle of luxury and prestige, Marcus found himself struggling in an entry-level position. Despite his academic brilliance, his first job offered only a bare minimum salary, a paycheck that barely covered his modest rent, let alone the expensive dinners and high-society events that defined Marina's social circle. Slowly, the admiration she once felt for his intellect began to be replaced by a cold frustration with his bank account. To Marina, his potential was no longer enough. She wanted the security and status her family had always known, and Marcus's meager earnings were not enough. Then came the silence that changed everything. Marcus sat alone in his small, dimly lit apartment, feeling the weight of a quietness that felt heavier than any physical object. Only hours before, his entire world had been dismantled not by a shouting match or dramatic confrontation, but by a brief, detached text message. Marina had written that she thought it was time for them both to move on. With those few words, the future he had meticulously planned in his mind vanished. The photographs of them laughing together on his wall now felt like relics from a different lifetime, and the apartment felt empty without the hope of her presence. He spent the long hours of the night trapped in a cycle of replaying every conversation they ever had. He dissected every minor argument and searched for the exact moment her love had turned into disappointment. He wondered if things would have been different if he had chosen a more lucrative career or if he had worked harder to impress her demanding parents. His mind became a chaotic storm of what-ifs and regrets that he couldn't switch off. As the sun began to rise, Marcus realized that he wasn't just mourning the girl he loved. He was mourning the person he had become while he was with her. In trying to bridge the gap between their worlds, he had lost his own sense of worth, leaving him feeling like a stranger in his own life. The passage of time became a blurred, indistinguishable haze for Marcus as days turned into weeks. He slowly transformed into a shadow of the man he once was, someone even he didn't recognize when he caught his reflection in the mirror. The vibrant, ambitious student who once believed he could conquer any challenge had been replaced by a recluse who found the simple act of leaving his apartment an exhausting task. He stopped picking up his phone, letting calls from concerned friends go to voicemail, and eventually, the ringing stopped altogether. To the outside world, it might have seemed like he was just taking a much-needed break to heal, but the reality was far more paralyzing. Inside the quiet walls of his home, Marcus was a prisoner of his own mind. He was caught in a relentless cycle of overthinking, where every past mistake was scrutinized, and every memory of Marina became a weapon against his self-esteem. He wasn't just grieving a breakup, he was drowning in the realization that his best efforts had failed to meet the standards of the world she belonged to. This sense of inadequacy followed him from room to room, making his books, his work, and his old passions feel utterly meaningless. In a desperate attempt to find relief, he tried every possible way to outrun the heaviness in his chest. He threw himself into mindless distractions, scrolling through screens for hours or pacing the floor until his legs ached, hoping to tire his brain into silence. He tried the fake-it-until-you-make-it approach, dressing up and pretending for a few minutes that he was fine, only to collapse back into bed the moment the facade became too heavy to carry. He told himself that if he ignored the heartache long enough, it would eventually lose interest and leave him alone. Ultimately, Marcus had to face a harsh and unavoidable truth that no amount of distraction could hide. He realized that the pain wasn't something behind him that he could outpace, it was something inside him that he had to carry. By trying to ignore the wound, he was only allowing it to fester. He finally understood that there were no shortcuts through the darkness, and that the only way to eventually reach the light was to stop running and actually walk through the fire. Accepting the pain was the hardest thing he had ever done, but it was the only way he could ever hope to find himself again. The shadows in the apartment had grown long as evening set in, and for the first time in weeks, Marcus didn't reach for a distraction to drown out the quiet. In the stillness, a single piercing thought finally cut through the fog of his grief. He began to wonder if he was going to allow this experience to be the thing that permanently broke his spirit, or if he could somehow use the wreckage of his old life to build something sturdier and better. There were no cinematic bursts of light or sudden surges of adrenaline. It wasn't the kind of dramatic turning point one might see in a movie. It was much heavier and more honest than that. He looked at his life, the empty rooms, the stalled career, and the fractured sense of self, and realized that staying in the wreckage was its own kind of choice. The realization wasn't fueled by excitement, but by a weary, grounded sense of truth. He understood that while he couldn't control Marina's departure or her family's judgment, he was the only one left in charge of what happened next. Right then and there, Marcus made a quiet pact with himself. He didn't promise to be happy by morning or to have his life perfectly figured out by the following week. He knew that trying to fix everything at once was what had kept him paralyzed for so long. Instead, he decided to move forward with slow, deliberate intention. He committed to the idea of rebuilding himself piece by piece, focusing on the small, manageable blocks of daily life rather than the overwhelming whole. He began to view his recovery not as a race to a finish line, but as a series of tiny, intentional habits. It started with the smallest things: making his bed, actually cooking a meal instead of skipping it, and reading a few pages of a book that had nothing to do with his past. He realized that the version of Marcus that Marina didn't want was gone, and that gave him the strange, quiet freedom to decide who the new Marcus would be. One habit at a time, he started the long process of laying a foundation that wasn't built on someone else's approval, but on his own quiet strength. Marcus decided to try an experiment that felt more frightening than any challenge he had faced in university. He deliberately chose to stop running, and for the first time, he sat down in the center of his apartment and invited the silence in. He turned off his phone, pushed away his laptop, and ignored the radio. There was no background hum to drown out his mind, just Marcus and the heavy, crowded thoughts he had been desperately trying to outrun for weeks. It was an act of raw courage disguised as stillness. In the beginning, the experience was almost physically painful. Without any noise to shield him, the memories of Marina's rejection and the sting of his own perceived failures rushed him like a tidal wave. He felt the urge to jump up, to grab his keys, or to find any small task to occupy his hands, just to make the internal noise stop. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating, and the urge to flee back into his distractions was nearly overwhelming. He felt exposed, sitting face to face with a version of himself that felt broken and small. However, as the minutes stretched into hours, a strange shift began to occur. The pain that had felt like a monster in the dark started to look different under the light of his direct attention. He noticed that the more he allowed himself to truly feel the sadness and the anger, the less power those emotions seemed to have over him. It was a profound revelation. The heartache wasn't what was destroying his life, but rather the constant, exhausting effort he spent trying to pretend it wasn't there. By choosing to face the discomfort head-on, Marcus began to dismantle the fear that had kept him paralyzed. He started to understand the roots of his sorrow, acknowledging that it was okay to be hurt by the gap between his world and Marina's. As he allowed himself to process these feelings instead of burying them, the mental fog began to clear. He wasn't waiting for the pain to disappear anymore. Instead, he was learning to walk through it. For the first time since the breakup, he felt the reins of his life returning to his own hands, discovering that true control didn't come from being fearless, but from refusing to let his fear dictate his silence. As Marcus spent more time in reflection, he began to notice a recurring pattern that was more damaging than any harsh word Marina or her wealthy family had ever spoken. He realized that a relentless internal narrator had taken up residence in his mind, constantly whispering that he was a failure. This voice was cruel and persistent, telling him that he wasn't enough and that his lack of money and status was the sole reason for his collapse. He decided that he could no longer let this internal bully have the final word, so he implemented a strict new rule for his mental health. Every time that negative voice spoke up to belittle him, Marcus would pause and challenge it. He didn't try to use empty, overly cheerful phrases or fake happiness, because he knew his brain wouldn't believe those lies. Instead, he met the criticism with cold, hard facts. When the voice told him he was a failure because of his low salary, he reminded himself that he had been an exceptional student who had built a reputation on his own merit, not on a family name. This shift from self-criticism to self-awareness changed the entire dynamic of his inner world. He stopped seeing his humble background as a defect and started seeing it as a testament to his resilience. He acknowledged that while he might not have been able to provide the lifestyle Marina's family demanded, he had provided genuine support, intelligence, and care. By looking at his life through the lens of truth rather than through the lens of Marina's expectations, the sharp edges of his regret began to soften. Gradually, The atmosphere inside his head began to feel less like a battlefield and more like a workshop. The harsh, mocking voice didn't disappear instantly, but it certainly lost its volume. As Marcus practiced this mental discipline, he felt a flicker of his old confidence returning, not a loud, boastful kind, but a quiet, steady assurance. He realized that his value wasn't a variable that went up or down based on someone else's opinion or a paycheck, but a constant that he was finally learning to respect again. Marcus stopped waiting for a sudden burst of inspiration or a better mood to strike before taking action. He realized that if he waited until he felt ready to change his life, he might be waiting forever. Instead, he made a pact with himself to tackle at least one difficult task every single day, regardless of how heavy his heart felt or how much his mind protested. He understood that motivation was a fair-weather friend, but discipline was something he could build with his own two hands. These daily challenges weren't grand, heroic gestures that would make headlines. They were quiet, personal victories. Some days, it meant dragging himself to the gym when his body felt like lead, and his bed felt like a sanctuary. Other days, it was the simple act of setting an alarm and actually getting up when it rang, refusing to let the morning slip away into a fog of rumination. He began to finish the tedious administrative chores and work projects he had been procrastinating on, the kind of tasks that usually felt like mountains but were actually just small hills he had been afraid to climb. Soon, this growing sense of self-reliability became the bedrock of a new kind of mental strength. He discovered that confidence wasn't about knowing he would always succeed, but about knowing he wouldn't abandon himself when he struggled. By consistently showing up for the small things, he repaired the broken trust between his mind and his actions. He wasn't just building muscle or finishing work, he was constructing a foundation of integrity that no breakup or external judgment could ever take away from him. Marcus reached a point where the quiet of his apartment no longer felt like a suffocating weight. He realized that for most of his life, he had been terrified of being alone, viewing it as a sign of being unwanted or forgotten. However, as the weeks passed, his perspective shifted in a way that surprised even him. He stopped seeing his solitude as a vast, empty hole that needed to be filled with someone else's presence or the noise of a busy social life. Instead, he began to see that emptiness as a precious, open space, a rare opportunity to grow, reflect, and finally get to know the person he had been ignoring for years. To navigate this new territory, he turned to the simple act of journaling. At first, the pages were filled with messy, frustrated scribbles, but as he kept at it, his thoughts became clearer and more profound. He sat with a pen and paper, digging through the layers of his personality that had been buried under the pressure of trying to impress Marina and her family. He asked himself hard questions about what he actually enjoyed, what his own values were, and what kind of man he wanted to be when no one was watching. Without the distraction of another person's expectations, he was finally able to hear his own voice. This period of deep thinking allowed Marcus to reconnect with his true self. He spent his evenings reading, exploring new ideas, and simply existing in his own company without the desperate need for external validation. The silence that used to scream at him began to feel like a calm, supportive friend. Ultimately, Marcus experienced a transformation that changed the very fabric of his daily life. The solitude that had once felt like a cruel punishment for his failures slowly began to feel like a source of immense power. Even as Marcus made progress, his recovery was not a smooth, upward climb. There were gray mornings when the progress he had made felt like a fragile illusion, and the old, heavy pain returned with a vengeance. On those days, the simple act of getting out of bed felt like trying to move through waist-deep mud, and the goal of rebuilding his life seemed utterly pointless. However, Marcus decided to live by one unwavering rule that became his lifeline. He simply refused to stop. He understood that on his darkest days, he didn't need to be a hero or make massive strides. He just needed to take one tiny microscopic step forward. If he couldn't face a full workout, he would at least walk around the block. If he couldn't focus on a complex book, he would read a single page. He realized that the size of the step didn't matter nearly as much as the fact that he was still moving. This relentless consistency, especially when his heart wasn't in it, gradually became his greatest asset. He began to see that anyone could be disciplined and optimistic when things were going well. The real test of his character, the true forging of his spirit, happened in the moments when he felt absolutely nothing but exhaustion and doubt. He realized that strength isn't a quality you are born with or something that appears when life is easy. It is a muscle that only grows when it is pushed to its absolute limit. He finally understood that his value wasn't defined by how he felt, but by the quiet, stubborn choice to keep walking through the storm until he reached the other side. As the months passed, The pain that had once felt like a jagged blade in his chest had been forged into a shield. There was a newfound stillness in his presence that others began to pick up on. At work, he moved with a level of focus and composure that made his colleagues pause, and in social settings, he no longer seemed desperate to prove his worth or hide his humble origins. He was calmer, not because he lacked problems, but because he finally trusted his ability to solve them. He had stopped looking at his life through the lens of what he lacked and started seeing the immense value in what he had built with his own two hands. He was finally in control of his internal world, which made the external world feel much less intimidating. Friends and acquaintances often commented on how well he was doing, marveling at his transformation as if it had happened by magic. They saw the result, but they remained blissfully unaware of the grueling process that had produced it. Marcus didn't feel the need to explain the struggle or demand credit for his resilience. He realized that the most important witness to his journey was himself. He no longer required the validation of a prestigious family or the approval of a girl who couldn't see his worth in a low-paying job. The private battles he had won in the quiet of his own mind were more meaningful than any public praise he could ever receive. He knew exactly what it had cost to become this version of himself, and that internal knowledge provided a sense of peace that no one could ever take away. The story concludes with a powerful message, and that is a call to action for anyone currently fighting their own battle. The core message is that these moments of profound struggle are actually crossroads, offering a definitive choice that defines a person's future. One could either allow the hardship to shatter their spirit permanently, or they could choose to let the pressure forge them into something much stronger. The real change wouldn't come from a sudden epiphany, but through the small, intentional habits a person chooses to practice every single day. It emphasized that while we often cannot control the things that happen to us, the heartbreaks, the job losses, or the cold messages, we are the absolute masters of our response. This YouTube channel is your daily push to become stronger, more focused, and truly unstoppable. Here, you'll find powerful stories, practical strategies, and motivation that actually stays with you long after the video ends. Every video is created to ignite that spark within you, the drive to rise, keep pushing forward, and refuse to settle for anything less than your absolute best. If you're ready to take control and turn your mindset into your greatest strength, hit that like button and subscribe to stay connected.